Welcome to Renewable Watch Podcast, your front row seat to what's really shaping India's renewable energy industry. I'm Mohammad Ali Siddiqui and I'm joined by my co-host Sarthak Takyar. In this episode, we break down the trends in the industry, why they matter, and where things might be headed. The stakes are high, the timeline is tight, and the questions are getting sharper. Our guest today is Dr. Rahul Tongia, Senior Fellow at CSEP and a leading researcher on India's energy transition. We're very happy to have you with us today. So, I'd like to start off with the first question. This is probably going to be the unifying question of all the discussion that we're going to have today. As India is electrifying mobility and industry faster than it is greening its grid, how do you think that we should think about the term greenness in these emerging sectors?
So, thank you for having me on the show. And I think it's a false dichotomy to place this as an either or proposition. And both will go hand in hand. It is true that decarbonizing the power sector is a little bit easier than decarbonizing many other sectors, but A, one can't wait. And B, there's a lot of structural changes that one needs to plan for. This will be a multi-year, if not multi-decade sort of a transition. And so just to say, oh, wait, the grid isn't green, therefore don't electrify mobility or don't electrify, doesn't make sense. Let's look a little deeper into just one example, which is mobility, which is easier for people to understand. Industry, of course, is dealt by the business persons, while mobility deals with consumers or consumers deal with mobility. And so if we just say how green is an EV, it's about how you benchmark and how you measure. And that's really where a lot of the nuances and trickiness comes into greenness. For the economy, we typically in fact, for all sectors, we typically first focus on the end use emissions. Very rarely do we have data or planning on system-wide effects, which include embedded or manufacturing emissions. So let's leave that aside. Now, in an EV, your choices are either I put in a liquid fuel, petrol or diesel, and then I could put in electrons coming from typically the grid. Very few people have their own electricity source dedicated for their EV. And so now you can do some arithmetic and say, what are my emissions per kilometer? Sort of easy to solve? Well, it's not so easy because how do you do the accounting for these? Because, as you pointed out, the Indian grid is not yet very green, it's still coal dominated in the order of 75%. That would lead one to think, well, it's not greening you too much. And that is true today, but over time, that figure is only going to get better. Then there's a lot of other details that people sometimes ignore, but the greenness depends on your usage or duty cycle. Do I use it a lot more for urban driving? Then an EV is better than the average numbers will tell you because of regenerative braking and very good start-stop acceleration, for example. If I drive a lot of kilometers, then an EV starts to get even better because the embedded cost of the carbon in the battery to make the battery that gets amortized or spread over a larger number of kilometers. And then, of course, from a consumer perspective, most people, I think, don't care so much about carbon directly. They care about kitna deti hai. You know that old phrase. What's the fuel efficiency of a car? So for them, rupees per kilometer is what it boils down to. Now, if I don't use an EV too much, I will never get a payback. So those who don't drive so much typically don't want to pay that upfront premium, which you recoup based on savings in rupees per kilometer. So these are all the sorts of moving parts. But to give a simple answer to your question, which very few answers are simple, unfortunately, it's more than just saying, is one thing green or greener?
Yeah. So that's an excellent response, actually. But this also gets us back to an analysis that you had perhaps done for CSEP on green tariffs, right? And because we were talking about the industry just now, uh, you know, sticking back to the grid itself, there was a regulation that was formed on green tariffs. And but at the same time, it is also important to ensure that there is at least some congruence in terms of the greening of your industries and mobility and also your grid, right? So but your analysis pointed out a very interesting caveat, and it said that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it said that if the way the green tariff has been set up, it is very likely that this would lead to the flight of large scale high paying, let's say, users of electricity from the state, which would lead to burdening of further finances of the discoms. So, how do you think that the two would relate to each other then?
So let me clarify, and this is a study collaborated by my colleague Dr. Sharat Rao as well, and Nikhil Tyagi were collaborators
Great.
on this study. Um, Now, large consumers could either leave the traditional tariff and go
Yes.
in for a green tariff, which is what would create burdens. Or very often they say, I'll put up my own green and I will exit the discom, either partly or in full. Now, the risk there is your green tariff lower than the current tariff? And is it truly capturing the costs to the discom for what they provide? And then there's another layer, which is how green is it? I'll come to that last part in a bit. Now, the way our electricity tariffs for electricity in India, retail consumer prices, are set up is that these are socialized, these are average. The regulator looks at what is your cost structure and then said you have a certain aggregate revenue requirement. And based on that average cost of supply, they set the tariffs to cover the cost. Now, this is the total average for the utility. Then we get differentiation based on type of consumer, industrial versus residential versus agriculture, etc. And within these, we sometimes have telescopic tiers or slabs based on a progressive nature, like income tax. The more you consume, the more you pay. Now, what this does is today, on average, commercial and industrial overpay to cross-subsidize other users. Now, the green tariffs, as they were originally envisaged by the ministry, were meant to be a little cheaper, partly reflecting the fact that middle of the day solar is now much cheaper. But these green tariffs, as of now, do not have a time of day aspect to them. So that is the first and foremost thing that I encourage everyone to step back and think about, which is what is the time at which you are consuming the electricity? That tells you how green is that electricity. My colleague Shyamashish Das at CSEP has a very nice paper on EVs and emissions. And what that shows is your grid is differently green or brown depending on when you consume power. Central Electricity Authority, CEA, puts out an average number. It's somewhere a little bit above 700 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is quite high by global standards. This is the average. Coal is close to 1,000, but we're not pure coal, so that average comes like this. Now, that average number varies quite obviously by time of day, because in the middle of the day, we have a lot more renewable, especially solar, and at night we know solar is virtually zero. In fact, it is zero unless it were going through a battery. And so your when you consume strongly determines how green or brown you are. Anyone interested in playing with these and learning more about it, we run a website called carbontracker.in, one word, carbontracker.in, and you can see 5-minute resolution, the supply mix by fuel and the carbon emissions, both present and historical over the last 7-8 years. So you can very clearly see this up and down that happens when you use it. So that's the first issue with the green tariffs. The second issue with the green tariffs is there additionality? This is the other key point that we should always think about when we talk about greening my system. If I don't have green supply at the time of consumption, then, or additional green supply to meet additional demand, then what does that mean? It means the rest of my grid is going to then supply that energy. So it's a zero sum game. So if I am getting a green tariff and turning greener, that means somebody else just turned browner, unless we had additionality of RE supply. And globally, there is this academic as well as policy thought that we want something called hourly matching. What that means is, at least based on an average over the hour, maybe not real time, we want to have enough RE supply as that demand that calls itself green. Otherwise, you're not incrementally greening. Here, another very important point to remember is that renewable energy has virtually zero marginal cost. It's use it or lose it. And when I say renewable, I'm focusing on wind and solar, which don't have storage, which is the majority of our renewable ambitions in India. Now, because these are use it or lose it, and in the current grid operations, they are deemed must run, they have to come first. Just because I plug in an EV or turn on a light bulb or turn on an industry factory process, it does not mean that the grid will add RE supply. In fact, based on the capacity one already has, one is, in theory, maximizing the RE unless there's a technical constraint. And then, if my demand goes up or down, it's fossil fuel, specifically coal for India, which is your marginal or swing producer. That is the reality in the near term. Of course, that assumes one does not have surplus RE and is not under the state of curtailment, which has already started happening in India, which is a more nuanced discussion. But this is the limitation for understanding additionality in the any grid, not just the Indian power grid.
I have a follow-up question based on what you just talked about, especially when you talked about the time of day use and at what time you're actually withdrawing energy that matters. And a topic related to this discussion about is about energy banking and how still a lot of renewable developers do bank their energy and find it more convenient than setting up storage projects. So they may bank energy at a time when the grid is actually greener and withdraw it at night when it's dependent on coal energy. So how do we balance policy making in this space in which we avoid greenwashing, but actually also help developers who prefer banking instead of investing in storage technologies?
I think without saying the word, you've already said the phrase, which is how do we balance this? There are trade-offs. On one side, you want to support green energy, but at the same time, you want to avoid greenwashing and really encourage people to get truly greener as much as possible. And that is the fundamental challenge. Banking is an accounting offset. And let me give the most simple example that people could maybe relate to. And this is detailed in a paper we have on defining green at CSEP. Cochin Airport is the world's first 100% solar powered airport. It's very good. And if you visit, you will see lots of solar panels on the parking lot, along the side of the runway. So there's a lot of storage. Oh, sorry, solar power. Is there any storage? No. So what they're doing is they are banking through the utility, the discom, their electricity company. In the middle of the day, they will over-generate solar compared to their demand. And in other periods, they will take back that electricity, claiming this is their solar power they're taking back, for which there's a nominal charge many states have set up that here's what you pay, either in percentage or paise per kilowatt hour for the facility of banking. Now, in the very short run, one may think that banking is great because it's a zero sum game. It can't be bad. So that is true. Now, this has a couple of implications or where it fails the scaling test and the additionality test. First, what does that uh, happens to the discom? They have to, at night, for example, buy extra power and give it to the discom while in the middle of the day, they're getting a lot of power. Those are not worth the same. In the middle of the day, we know that prices are low. You can get solar for a couple of rupees a kilowatt hour, or when you're in the surplus era, it's nearly zero prices in the power exchange that we see today. And at night, we know that the prices are very high. You have to get peaking power. You have to get, in the power exchange, you're hitting the caps of 10 rupees. And so these are not the same. So there is a financial burden upon the discom, which they then have to pass through to other consumers because they have to cover their costs. Now, this is just the economic side. Now, the question is, what does the utility do with that extra solar in the middle of the day? They may give it to a factory. So Sarthak or Ali, if you have a factory, they would give it to you, or if at home, you would get this power. Now, this power at night, we know was generated at the margin in India through coal. That power going to a third party and the airport in the middle of the day, between both of them, both cannot be green. So with banking, what happens is one entity can claim greenness, but the system cannot claim greenness for all the electrons. Because this is now a key point of accounting, attributional versus consequential emissions accounting. There are two ways to look at it. One is looking at the margin, one is looking on average, and they give you very different answers. Now, consequentially, here is the belief or claim or the guidance a lot of people will use. Look, I get it. Both cannot be green. So right now, this extra solar in the middle of the day will displace coal. So even if you ran coal at night, in the middle of the day, you get rid of coal. So consequentially, it's a wash. That's the theory. There are two problems with this. One, this only works up to the point where you are not surplus of RE in the middle of the day, which we are either approaching or we know we will be in a couple of years for sure, given the ambitious RE targets and action we have in India. The second, let's look at it from that factory perspective. If a factory has daytime load, many of them do, what's stopping them from putting up their own solar plant themselves? Because then they're aligned with their demand and this will be cheaper. Why did I need this airport to put up the solar panels? The utility could have procured it from anyone at a cheaper price than what it cost the utility with banking. So these are some of the challenges with scaling banking. I'm not saying they're right or wrong necessarily. They were useful up to a point, but now we need to improve the instruments that we're running to encourage, support, and scale renewable energy. If we don't do proper accounting, here's the risk. And this is something we have seen time and time again. Something that is useful in the beginning, if we don't take it away, people get used to it. And then it's very hard to take it away and it creates distortions. So if it doesn't add up, someone has to pay. There's no free lunch. And second, if it hurts the utility, they have an urge to do sort of go slow. We saw this with open access. Open access is not about green necessarily, but you would lose so-called paying customers. So then there was implicit resistance in many cases for the technical aspects of giving the connections and managing them. And that same phenomenon we have seen periodically with green. If you're losing your best customers or it creates grid burdens for the utility, there's a resistance to it. We need to figure out how much is a win-win-win across these three sets of stakeholders.
Also, another follow-up question based on this and a broader policy implication as well. Are we ready for carbon markets, for efficient carbon markets then? If we have so much discussion still left about whether renewable projects are additional or not. So should they be qualified for carbon credits, or which particular renewable projects, solar, wind, should be qualified for carbon credits, which should not be? And so are we prepared for these answers yet?
So as of now, the electricity power sector is not part of India's CCTS carbon trading emissions market. So it's a moot question. So as of now, what notifications have come for targets are all for some of the industrial hard to abate sectors. And not even all of them, just the larger ones. And so the power sector is not part of it. It'll be a little while. This is just speculation. I believe the government may be planning to first see how it performs, see how it behaves, how people adapt, where the prices fall, before taking a call whether to add in the power sector or not.
But what would be your view on this? Should it be added or not? And if it's added, then what should be the implication for the renewable segments?
In the short run, meaning the early amount of credits, the power sector is typically, on average, cheaper than decarbonizing many other sectors because those are very capital intensive. You may need to change your entire process. We know, for example, green hydrogen entails a premium. That's not trivial. So if you brought in the power sector, what would likely happen, and there are modeling studies at CSEP, at CEW, and a number of places that have looked at it, you would find a lot more decarbonization shifting through the market mechanism, not by industry, but now being done by the power sector. So they would go up their curve of decarbonization faster than other sectors would. So what this would do is it may look cheaper at an equilibrium level, but it delays decarbonization innovation to some extent in other sectors. Now, what would happen to renewables? I mean, obviously, the demand for renewable energy would grow up dramatically, which would then lead to the question, is that going to also raise prices for electricity? Electricity consumers, those are very different segments. The implications of a price rise or even a carbon price is very asymmetric. So, for example, in steel, it's a smaller fraction of your cost structure, energy or fuel. While in power production, it's much higher. Like in coal power plants, it's half or sometimes more depending on the location and the vintage of the plant. And so it's a very, very different implication on consumers and the economy. So I think this is something that we will have to model very transparently and then experiment with or see where the prices and implications are going. The European prices, just for a benchmark, are somewhere in the order typically now 60 to 80 euros a ton CO2. If we had such high prices for India, hypothetically, in the power sector, we're talking of something more than 6 rupees a kilowatt hour impact on coal-based power. That's, in my opinion, unmanageable.
The reason I had raised the question because Ali and I had attended a lecture recently on additionality, and there was a comparison between renewable projects and forestry projects. And obviously, a major discussion happened on how forestry projects seem to be more additional than RE projects, and if how our government funds should be more channelized towards such kind of projects and how to be more efficient once the carbon market comes in. So that was the reason behind I asked this. Also, you talked about several sectors in
Can
which
I can I put, dig in a little more? Again,
sure.
um, these things are unfortunately never, as I said, easy. And I'm notorious for asking my students, um, do you want the long answer or the very long answer? Because there's no short answer. So with forests, is it an apples to apples comparison with RE? And one differentiator is timeframes. With forests, you get asymmetric value early years versus mature years, or you'll get it over time. But in a lot of the accounting attempts people have done, they've taken all that value upfront as a commodity that they can trade, which doesn't necessarily make sense. You have the problem with forests of additionality, which isn't always necessarily there. Adding a forest is additional, but preserving a forest. So now there are market mechanisms where people have been paid to not cut down a forest because it would have been cut down. How do you really know it would have been cut down? Maybe these were anyways semi-protected or protected or not up for cutting down. And then you have a permanence problem. One forest fire, boom, you lose a lot of it. Um, and then there's leakage, which is another question on quality of offsets, the voluntary carbon market. Let's say I protect this forest. Well, all that did is the neighbor forest, which was not protected, finds more logging because I've tightened down in one set of forests. So there's so many questions, and unfortunately, the data are not very positive worldwide on the quality of forests. So yes, bang for buck if that's your criteria. Forests look cheaper. Are they better? I wouldn't necessarily jump to that conclusion.
Anyway, moving on, we would like to perhaps we could also talk about the we could extend the conversation to green hydrogen, right? And this becomes aptly necessary because in light of the recent, not very recent, but the CBAM regulations, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Do you think our export markets in that sense should also be a lot more stringent because we would not to lose out on that value addition in trade for in order to meet the carbon CBAM regulations?
Absolutely. I think the buyer sets the terms typically. So sometimes they've even said, I need dedicated RE, additional RE, hourly matching, maybe not today, but by 2030. So for these norms will really drive what Indian entities will have to do, and they will not be allowed most likely to qualify through banking. Now, there was an attempt in discussions with certain companies. They say they have a green portfolio, so they will allocate the green to this project or to these tons of hydrogen or steel or whatever. And therefore, those are demonstrably hourly matched. But then the question some people have asked is, well, if you're allocating your green to this, that means you're now de facto allocating the residual brown to your rest of your steel for domestic usage. So consequentially, it doesn't help. So some countries have said, we want to look at your dear producer, dear company, we want to look at your fleet average before we take a call on how green. You cannot say this plant or this ton was greener or green with this calculation. So these are global trends that will force Indian companies interested in exports to tighten how they do it. But the good news is this is a signal. This is a signal that we need additionality, we need more RE, and we want to try and get it such that it's not just vanilla solar in the middle of the day, which is green and cheap, but not very flat in its output.
But don't you think that, I mean, many experts have pointed out that this might be yet another trade protectionist measure by some of the countries in Europe? And especially considering the fact that a lot of countries in the, we could call it the global south, have a lot of catching up to do in terms of late industrialization. So it is perhaps a bit unfair to put these restrictions on these countries. So what would your view be on this?
At a very personal level, who the heck said climate change is unfair? Is fair?
Yeah.
It's not. Let's accept that and then figure out what do we do with it. If one was asking for equity, then this is a phrase that I hear a lot. Markets are based around this mantra, all carbon is equal. So therefore, let's find the cheapest place to get rid of it. If all carbon is equal, and we know the half-life of carbon in the atmosphere is centuries, then you can't ignore historical emissions because those are all part of where we are in terms of what carbon budget is remaining for what sort of damage functions. So if one was truly being fair, we would need to put a price or a value or at least some implication of, as you pointed out, the historical emissions, not just ones that have burnt away in an abstract sense, but ones that literally have led to cement and steel and economic might and development, quote unquote, where other countries are yet to build the roads, the houses that they will and are and need to build. So that will lead to carbon. To be penalized for that just is unfair. We need to find better equilibrium. Now, I get why at one level CBAM has a certain intellectual value. They want to prevent leakage, which is intellectually correct. But then we need a correction or mechanism to adjust for this unfairness or historical legacy, or treat it as an imputed help that they can give, cheap finance, certain other things. The current equilibrium just is not working well.
So, what about the internal emissions that take place in the manufacturing processes or even in battery materials? Do you think that the trade-off between creating cheaper batteries right now versus cleaner supply chains is a fair trade-off?
I don't, again, coming back to it's not an either or proposition. The first step is we should really have a good handle on what is the embedded carbon in any process. So there are studies that show this. If you build a solar panel, if you build a wind turbine, if you build a nuclear power plant, which operationally are treated as zero emissions, or even biomass, you are using some fossil fuels either for manufacturing or transport today. So unless you can provably decarbonize that supply chain part, you're stuck with the rest of the economy or how trucking happens or manufacturing happens. The good news is, for most of these cases, the carbon payback for embedded is measured only in a few years. So what that means is, yes, it's non-zero, but no, it's not a bottleneck. You should still be doing it. It just means your hurdle is a little bit higher than it would have been only from operating measurements. So that's one part. The second, how are you using it? I come back to the EVs as an example. If I don't drive many kilometers, I'll never get that payback. If I drive a lot of kilometers, that premium is worth it. That cost premium and carbon embedded are both worth it because I'll pay that back. So how you use it really matters for embedded. And then, of course, and the good news, and I hope my overall message is not very negative, but it's really, let's be transparent in our accounting, but recognize that the trends are unilaterally positive. The
Yes.
grid is getting greener. We are figuring out how to think beyond just add more solar, which is the low-hanging fruit, but we all know it's never going to be enough to take us to net zero. So there is supply side options, wind, batteries, other RE, maybe nuclear's growth, but also let's come back to demand side. We typically have focused on supply side options. Demand is at two levels. One, efficiency, which all of us understand, but now something less well understood, which is time of day and usage. If I could ensure EVs are charged almost only in the middle of the day, except emergencies where you can't plan, but planned charging is only daytime aligned, that's a win-win. It's cheap and it's green. It needs infrastructure accordingly. That's the bottleneck. If I can get demand alignment to green supply, then I'm able to absorb more RE without needing as much battery, and my costs will fall. So we need to rethink our electricity systems around not just rupees per kilowatt hour, which is the old mantra, but to value capacity, firmness, flexibility. We're not paying for these today properly. We're not incentivizing them properly. These are the real future. I always laugh at, my family taught me, when you leave a room, you switch the lights off. Save energy. If I have a pure RE system with just let's say, storage and a battery, solar and a battery. It does not save any money by switching the lights off because the marginal cost is zero at that point. It's a very different world.
Listening to the entire conversation, and we have focused a lot on the greenwashing aspect of the storage segment of solar, wind, green hydrogen. But what about the larger oil and gas companies? And uh, are we focusing too much on the smaller EV and smaller solar battery companies who are generally trying to innovate, but ignoring the historical emissions of the larger oil and gas companies who may try to deflect responsibility or focus on what they call transition fuel or transition technologies like CCUS and green hydrogen? But some climate enthusiasts may call it greenwashing. So, is the current discourse of greenwashing unfair to these smaller EV solar battery companies, or do you think oil and gas companies are also being scrutinized similarly?
Well, I think the light is everywhere. The only question becomes who's more open to that and has something that they can easily do. With a lot of the smaller entities, there's an easier path ahead. With oil and gas, one, they say, well, what's the alternative? And we're not quite there yet, especially for certain sectors. We don't use much oil in the power sector or gas in India's case, but in other countries they do. And so it's going to be a, like I said, decadal shift to phase out the gas that's used in the power sector in a lot of other countries. And the companies will say, I'm just responding to demand. I'm not necessarily creating the demand. Now, that being said, a lot of the focus of the ONG majors globally has been on petrochemicals. And that's an area where they say the demand for crude is not going down. You need more and more synthetics, plastics, etc. So I don't really lose any sleep worrying about their future. Even in a decarbonizing world, they're not disappearing anytime soon. The question is how quickly, to me, it's never how quickly can I get rid of something. It's more how quickly can we get better alternatives so they go away gracefully. If you remember your history, in the mid 1800s, the dominant fuel for lighting was whale blubber. And of course, that created problems. It was displaced with petroleum only after petroleum discoveries in Pennsylvania and then elsewhere. And then from that, we had gas lamps and then electric lighting. Then within electric, we had incandescent to tube lights, CFLs, now LEDs. So there's always innovation that's disrupting. I just want to close with a few thoughts.
Yeah,
And again, this is almost like lies, damn lies, and statistics, that famous phrase.
yeah, yeah.
Is greening supposed to be measured in an absolute sense or a relative sense? So India's grid, my colleague Shamashish Das had a key insights PowerPoint on our website at CSEP, where we track the emission factor of the Indian electricity grid vis-a-vis 5 or 10 other countries. And unfortunately, it's not doing too well. The emission factor between 2013 and 23 has not improved that much. It's also not changed that much for Indonesia, but China has improved. Most countries have improved. But what that misses is the total kilowatt hours that Indians use per capita is really low. So the net impact is actually modest. China may have decarbonized now 20% vis-a-vis India's emission factors, how grams CO2 per kilowatt hour. But the number of kilowatt hours they use is multiple times higher. So the total impact is what you should look at. So depending on what you're looking for, you can say, well, my grid is getting greener. Maybe, but you're still using a lot of it. So this is where you have complexities in doing comparisons. So India's grid is not just, it is brown and getting greener, but it's also relatively small. So the impact per capita is very, very modest, if not low, is something countries should be mindful of when being concerned about India's growth. It's very easy to have growth from a very low base. Just to give you a series of numbers on CO2 emissions per capita of fossil fuel, the emissions from 1 billion plus people of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa, which is a major emissions country, but the rest is only a little bit more than the fossil CO2 emissions from 10 million, sub 10 million people of UAE. That is the level of disparity we have in emissions. So to me, if someone says, well, in Africa, they're adding a fossil fuel plant that shouldn't be allowed, my reaction is no. They need development. Development comes first, and India has prioritized the balance, to use the phrase you had alluded to, Sarthak, balance. It's balancing greening and development. I think that's a very respectable strategy and trajectory.
Yeah, that's it from our side. Actually, we've asked you all the questions that we had, and we pretty much covered all the topics that we wanted to cover. It was a fascinating discussion. One thing that I really liked about this discussion is that very few guests are able to break down complex topics to a wider audience as you have been able to do. So, and especially considering the fact that we want podcast to be more accessible than some of the other podcasts, that is a great situation for us. So, thank you for coming on this show. We're very happy to have you.